So imagine a country with a population that's roughly the size of the Houston metro area.
Right, which is pretty small in the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. But now imagine that same tiny country basically dictating the energy grid for an entire continent of like 450 million people.
Yeah, on paper, it sounds completely absurd.
It really does. I mean, usually when we talk about international relations or, global influence, we rely on this very comforting, very predictable kind of mathematical logic.
Like geopolitics has its own laws of physics or something.
Right. You measure a country's total landmass, you count their active aircraft carriers, you calculate their GDP, and the equation just spits out their exact level of power on the global stage.
Big countries have loud voices,
Mhm.
and small countries are just expected to sit quietly and take notes.
Exactly. It's a framework that political scientists find, I don't know, incredibly reassuring, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. We love to categorize the world into, G7 superpowers, emerging markets. It creates this very neat, visible hierarchy.
But the moment you start examining the actual reality of European politics, and specifically the foreign policy of Denmark, that entire mathematical equation completely shatters.
It falls apart at the seams.
It really does, and that is exactly what we are unpacking today. So, welcome to Diplomacy and International Relations. I am thrilled you are joining us for this deep dive.
It's going to be a fascinating one.
Before we get into the mechanics of how a state this small wields like this much power, I want to quickly encourage you, the listener, to follow and subscribe wherever you get your audio.
Yes, please do.
And a quick note, you can also subscribe to our deep dives on Patreon. That directly helps keep the lights on here, but it also gains you access to a ton of extra content.
Which is really valuable if you're into this stuff.
Totally. Including exclusive weekly and monthly briefings specifically focused on the internal gears of Danish politics. The link for that is right down in the description.
And I highly recommend checking out those briefings if today's topic catches your interest. Because honestly, you absolutely cannot understand Copenhagen's external global moves without understanding the precise internal pressures of their domestic politics.
Right. The two are completely intertwined.
Exactly. You can't separate them.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are going to decode the highly unique, incredibly pragmatic, and frankly, aggressively ambitious foreign policy and climate diplomacy of Denmark.
Yeah, aggressive is definitely the right word there.
Right. We're talking about a nation of fewer than 6 million people that is actively shaping European energy highways, brokering these massive international climate treaties, and completely redefining how global development aid is deployed.
As a tool for national security, no less.
Which is wild. So to answer how they pull this off, we have to look past the surface-level press releases, right? We're going to isolate the underlying DNA of Danish international relations by synthesizing decades of strategic evolution.
We'll be looking at historical analyses of their 1960s trade maneuvers within the European Free Trade Association, examining the highly tactical bureaucratic strategies they deploy during their EU presidencies.
And dissecting modern strategic documents like their global development framework, the world we share.
Right, and we'll also dig into the engineering and geopolitical implications of their massive new offshore energy islands.
Because when you line all of this up from post-war agricultural trade to modern climate tech, a very deliberate, very ruthless pattern of statecraft emerges.
You're remarkably consistent.
So to understand the offshore wind farms and the climate treaties of today, we actually have to rewind the clock. We need to go back to the 1960s.
A completely pivotal era for European integration.
Yeah, the continent was essentially split into two competing economic blocs. You had the European Free Trade Association, or EFTA, which was led by the UK.
Right.
And you had the Emerging European Economic Community, the EEC, which was driven heavily by France and West Germany.
And if you look at the archival records and the internal diplomatic memos from this formative period, they reveal something really crucial about the Danish mindset.
Which was what, exactly?
Well, when Denmark engaged in these early European integration talks, their primary goal was not some lofty ideological dream of a unified European utopia.
They weren't sitting around a campfire singing about a continent without borders.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, they were not quoting Poetry in Brussels. Their approach was brutally pragmatic. It was entirely about the protection of their massive agricultural export sector.
Oh, so we are talking about butter, bacon, and cheese.
Exactly. Post-World War II, the agricultural question was literally the defining issue of Danish domestic politics. Their economy was incredibly reliant on exporting farm goods.
Right.
And to protect those vital exports in a rapidly changing Europe, the Danish state cultivated a completely new breed of civil servant. They became known as the Markedsdiplomater, or market diplomats.
Market diplomats. Just the phrase market diplomat implies a total merging of roles, doesn't it?
Oh, it was a deliberate, institutional blurring of the lines. Traditional diplomacy, like the kind practiced by the British or the French, was about grand treaties,
Yeah.
territorial borders, military
The
alliances.
classic geopolitical stuff.
Right. But this new Danish diplomacy was entirely about market access,
Yeah.
supply chains, and sector protection.
So these guys were basically economists in diplomatic suits.
Yeah, pretty much. These markets diplomators were economically oriented officials who operated right on the bleeding edge between domestic economic interests and external trade negotiations.
Wow.
They were not aristocrats. They were highly competent, deeply pragmatic bureaucrats whose primary directive was maintaining flexibility.
Because flexibility meant survival.
Right. Exactly.
And you might be wondering why a small country would be so terrified of getting locked into an alliance. It's because Denmark was caught in a massive geopolitical vice grip at the time.
They had a traditional, deep reliance on the UK as their primary export market for agricultural goods.
For all that bacon.
For all the bacon. But they were simultaneously looking at the reality of West Germany, which was experiencing this explosive post-war economic miracle.
So Germany was becoming an absolutely necessary trading partner.
Precisely. And the UK and West Germany were navigating the European integration process on completely divergent paths.
Right. The UK was deeply skeptical of the EEC's supranational ambitions, preferring the looser EFTA model.
While Germany was the economic engine of the EEC. So Denmark was stuck right in the middle, heavily reliant on both.
But instead of just passively waiting to see how the titans of Europe would carve up the market, Danish leadership took aggressive initiative, didn't they?
They did. For example, the Danish Prime Minister actively secured a bilateral face-to-face meeting with German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer to guarantee agricultural quotas.
Wait, really? Just bypassed everyone else?
Yeah, you have to understand how massive that was at the time. A tiny Scandinavian state bypassing the larger bloc negotiations to secure a direct, high-level audience with the most powerful leader in continental Europe.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to propose an analogy here. Was Denmark basically playing the role of the clever middle child?
How do you mean?
Like playing the parents Britain and Germany against each other to protect their own allowance, which in this case was an uninterrupted flow of pork and dairy exports?
That analogy holds up beautifully, actually, especially when you examine the Danish press coverage from that specific era.
Oh, what were they saying?
The media in Copenhagen was actively and openly discussing this urgent need to step out of Britain's shadow. The UK was clearly pursuing its own sovereign interests, sometimes completely independently of its EFTA partners.
Right, looking out for number one.
Exactly. The Danish public and their Marcus Diplomator recognized that if they simply followed London's lead blindly, they would become collateral damage in a broader European trade war.
So their national identity didn't stem from being a great military conqueror or having some huge global empire.
No, not at all.
It was an identity built entirely on being smarter, faster, and more technically proficient than everyone else in the room.
Precisely. They framed their geopolitical identity through bureaucratic competence and sector-oriented diplomacy.
We're just better at the paperwork.
Yeah. It was an identity built on the premise that, we're a small state, we cannot force anyone to do anything with the Navy, but we can make deliberate, highly calculated bureaucratic adjustments to secure our economic survival.
They realized early on that their influence had to come from an almost surgical application of economic diplomacy.
And that brings us perfectly to the present day. Because this 1960s blueprint, this strategy of using intense bureaucratic competence to protect a primary economic export, it didn't disappear when the European Union finally matured.
It just changed industries.
Exactly. The tactical machinery is identical.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of bacon and butter, the new vital export is wind turbines and green technology.
Okay, that is a wild pivot. But upgraded feels like an understatement when you look at the sheer scale of the numbers today.
Oh, the numbers are staggering.
The explosive growth of Denmark's green sector is just nuts. By 2019, sustainable energy technology accounted for roughly 13 billion euros in Danish exports.
Yeah, let's contextualize that. For a country of their size, 13 billion euros is a massive chunk of their GDP.
Right. Imagine if the U.S. suddenly started exporting hundreds of billions of dollars worth of a single specialized technology.
It completely transforms your economy.
And the Danish government's strategy isn't just to coast on that success. They are actively targeting a doubling of that figure to 140 billion Danish kroner in green exports by 2030.
Which is incredibly ambitious.
You look at companies like Ørsted and Vestas, these are no longer just national champions. They are the undisputed global heavyweights in offshore wind energy.
Which leads us directly to the core of their modern European strategy. Because Denmark's climate policy is rarely discussed in purely environmental terms within the halls of their foreign ministry.
Surely, it's not just about saving the planet.
No, it's a seamless, inseparable fusion of political identity and hard, undeniable economic self-interest. You have to look at the math of their EU membership.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Denmark is a net contributor to the EU budget.
Meaning they put more money into the central pot in Brussels through their membership fees than they take out in direct agricultural or development subsidies.
Correct. So if you are a Danish diplomat, simply going to Brussels and asking for more EU funding isn't a winning economic strategy.
Because you're basically just asking for your own taxpayers' money back.
Exactly. And you probably won't get it anyway, because the funds are designed to flow to the poorer eastern and southern member states.
Right, that makes sense. So how do you get a return on your European investment then?
You use your diplomatic weight to push for incredibly stringent, highly ambitious European environmental regulations.
Ah, I see where this is going. This is where we see them pushing the EU to increase its 2030 climate target to at least a 55% reduction in emissions.
Yep.
And heavily backing the massive regulatory framework of the European Green Deal.
Exactly. They want the environmental rules governing all 27 member states to be as legally strict as possible. And why is that?
Because when the entirety of Europe is forced by law to transition to green energy, who do they have to buy the technology from?
They have to buy it from the people who already invented it, scaled it, and commercialized it.
They buy Danish tech.
Bingo.
But wait, I have to push back on this a little bit. If they are aggressively legislating a green Europe specifically to guarantee a massive captive market for their own wind turbines, that sounds less like idealistic climate diplomacy and more like a hostile corporate takeover disguised as environmentalism. Are they just weaponizing the climate crisis for GDP growth?
It's easy to view it cynically. I mean, it is undoubtedly the ultimate sales pitch. But the analysis of their domestic politics shows that the environmental concern is also deeply genuine.
Okay, so it's both.
Right. The Danish electorate genuinely demands aggressive climate action. It's a foundational part of their modern national identity. The brilliance of the Danish state is not that they are faking environmentalism.
It's that they've figured out how to make it highly profitable.
Exactly. They have perfectly aligned their planetary survival goals with their macroeconomic growth goals. But there is an even deeper political theory at play here regarding why Denmark fights so relentlessly in the environmental sector.
Oh, what's that?
It comes down to something political scientists call the integration dilemma.
Let's break that down for the listener. The integration dilemma exists because Denmark actually has several official, legally binding opt-outs from key EU treaties, right?
Yes. Most notably, they opted out of the Economic and Monetary Union, meaning they retained the Danish krone and do not use the euro.
Right.
And they historically had a major opt-out regarding the common security and defense policy, which kept them out of EU military coordination for decades.
So they're kind of halfway in on some of the biggest European projects.
Exactly. And because they're legally locked out of those massive arenas of European power, currency, and defense, they operate with a severe deficit of traditional geopolitical influence.
So to compensate for being absent from the rooms where monetary policy and military strategy are decided, they must absolutely dominate in other areas.
You nailed it. They have chosen climate, energy, and labor markets. If they do not lead aggressively in these sectors, they risk becoming entirely marginalized within the European project.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. If you can't play on the football field or the baseball diamond because you opted out of those sports, you have to be the undisputed, terrifying world champion of the tennis court. Otherwise, no one pays attention to you.
That is a perfect visualization of the integration dilemma. They literally have to overcompensate in their chosen arenas.
But that brings us to the operational reality, which is, how exactly does a state of under 6 million people actually force a massive sluggish bloc of 27 sovereign nations to adopt its preferred, highly ambitious policies?
This is not easy.
Right, because having the best wind turbines is a great starting point, but forcing the French, the Germans, and the Polish to change their domestic laws is an entirely different challenge.
And that requires highly specialized, almost surgical tactical maneuvering inside the actual committee rooms in Brussels.
So let's talk about that. To understand this, we can look at a brilliant analysis of Denmark's 2012 EU presidency.
Yeah, so for context, the EU presidency rotates among the member states every 6 months. It is the country's turn to chair the meetings, set the agenda, guide the legislative process.
But the unwritten rule, like the absolute sacred norm of Brussels, is that the presidency is supposed to act as an impartial, neutral broker, right?
Exactly. You are supposed to build consensus and find middle ground, not just ram your own national agenda down everyone else's throat.
Yet the academic research classifies Denmark as an activity leader. They are infamous in Brussels for being incredibly well organized, relentless, and completely pushing the boundaries of that neutral role.
Well, they definitely push it. During their 2012 presidency, they were trying to pass the Energy Efficiency Directive, which was a massive piece of legislation aimed at reducing energy consumption across the continent.
And they hit a brick wall.
They encountered severe technical gridlock. The European legislative process relies heavily on working groups, which are made up of technical experts and engineers from the member states.
And what happened in those groups?
In 2012, these technical groups were completely bogged down in the weeds. They could not agree on the math, the definitions of efficiency, or the specific technical requirements for retrofitting buildings.
Now, if you are a technical expert sent from Berlin or Paris, your mandate is incredibly narrow. You are terrified of straying from the spreadsheet your minister gave you.
Exactly, you don't have the authority. You cannot make political compromises. You can only argue about the exact thickness of insulation.
So the entire directive is basically dying a slow, bureaucratic death. How does Denmark save it?
They deploy a tactic known as process impartiality.
Process impartiality, what is that?
It's a vital concept for understanding Danish influence. It means you follow the procedural rules of the institution so strictly, so obsessively, and so fairly that no one can ever accuse you of cheating or violating your role as the neutral chair.
Okay, but how does that help?
Because you use your deep mastery of those exact rules to completely upend the dynamic of the negotiation. In a highly unusual and aggressive move, the Danish presidency realized the technical experts were paralyzed.
Right.
So they took the negotiations entirely out of the technical working group and elevated the entire directive straight to the core Ripper level.
For the listener who hasn't spent time navigating the Brussels bubble, Core Ripper stands for the Committee of the Permanent Representatives. It is the room where the actual ambassadors from each member state meet.
Exactly. And the psychological and political dynamic in corporate is completely different. As you noted, technical experts have narrow, rigid mandates.
But ambassadors?
Ambassadors, however, have broad, high-level political mandates from their prime ministers. They have the political cover to horse trade. They don't argue about insulation thickness. They argue about national interests.
So this is a brilliant mechanical shift. It's like changing the venue of a trial to get a completely different jury who cares about different evidence.
It really is.
If you cannot win the argument based on the rules of the current room, you use your power as the chair to physically move the legislation into a room where the players have the authority to actually make a deal.
And moving it to the ambassadors allowed Denmark to deploy their second major tactic, which is relational impartiality.
Okay, what's that one?
Well, because ambassadors can engage in issue linkage, meaning, I will give you a concession on agricultural funding if you support me on this energy efficiency target. Denmark had the space to forge a completely unexpected coalition.
They looked past all their usual friends and teamed up with Poland.
Which shocked many observers.
I bet. I mean, historically, in environmental matters, Denmark naturally aligns with Germany, Sweden, and Finland, the traditional, wealthy, green Nordic and Western European states.
But in this specific 2012 negotiation, those traditional allies actually opposed the rigid efficiency models Denmark was pushing.
Why?
Because they wanted to protect their own existing, highly complex national systems. They didn't want to change their domestic laws.
So Denmark looks off the table, realizes their usual allies are blocking them, and locks eyes with Warsaw. Now, you have to understand Poland's position in 2012.
Very different from Denmark's.
Poland was heavily reliant on coal. They did not share Denmark's green progressive ideology in the slightest.
But Poland had two massive overriding priorities at the time: achieving energy independence from Russian natural gas and securing financial cohesion support from the EU budget.
I see.
The Danish Marx diplomator realized that the Energy Efficiency Directive, while technically a climate policy, could be sold to Poland as a geopolitical security policy.
That is so clever.
If Poland massively increased its energy efficiency, it would inherently reduce its overall energy demand, thereby reducing its reliance on Russian gas imports.
So how exactly did they seal the deal?
By allying with Poland, Denmark offered them a seat at the leadership table, likely with implicit understandings regarding financial support mechanisms for transition. By forging this alliance, Denmark displayed perfect relational impartiality. They proved to the rest of the bloc that they weren't just a stubborn stooge for the Nordic Green Alliance.
They were perfectly willing to cross traditional geographic and ideological fault lines to get a piece of legislation passed.
Exactly. And this placed immense unexpected pressure on the Western member states who thought they could just quietly kill the bill.
It's basically 3D chess at that point, right?
Yeah.
And their ruthlessness doesn't stop at the council doors either.
Not at all.
When they faced further roadblocks from specific stubborn governments, the Danish diplomats didn't just give up. They used the European Parliament as a pressure valve.
Yes, they actively teamed up with a Green Party rapporteur from Luxembourg and various environmental NGOs based in Germany.
Which perfectly illustrates how modern Danish diplomats view loyalty and leverage. For them, alliances are no longer strictly determined by national borders.
No, they are determined by overlapping political interests. If the German government is blocking you in the council, you bypass the government entirely, team up with German environmental NGOs, and use them to generate domestic media pressure on that very same German government from the inside.
You squeeze the legislative process from both ends.
It is staggering bureaucratic efficiency.
Truly.
Yeah.
But we also see this exact same mastery of the rules, this norm entrepreneurship play out when Denmark is on the defensive, particularly in labor policy.
Yes.
If you look at how they handle EPSCO, which is the Employment, Social Policy, Health and Consumer Affairs Council, it is a masterclass in building a firewall.
Because labor policy is the ultimate red line for Denmark due to their unique domestic setup, which is called democratic corporatism.
Right. Let's explain what that actually looks like on the ground in Copenhagen, because it's so different from the rest of Europe.
Very different.
Unlike France or Spain, where the government frequently steps in to mandate a national minimum wage or dictate strict working hours via top-down legislation, the Danish state largely stays out of it.
Right. Instead, they have a tripartite system. The government, the massive employers associations, and the highly organized trade unions all sit down together and negotiate wages, benefits, and conditions collectively.
It is a deeply ingrained, highly functional system of collective bargaining. And the Danish are terrified that well-meaning bureaucrats in Brussels will try to impose a one-size-fits-all EU minimum wage or labor directive.
Because that would legally overwrite and destroy this delicate tripartite balance. They fiercely protect this model from any EU interference.
So how do you protect your borders from EU overreach without looking like a stubborn anti-European nationalist?
You go to Brussels and you use the tactic of aggressive positivity.
Aggressive positivity. I love that.
It's true. The Danish diplomats go into these EPSCO meetings and act like the ultimate supportive team players. They constantly praise other countries' domestic initiatives.
Oh, Germany, your new youth employment policy is wonderful. France, excellent work on your pension reform.
Exactly. It is entirely strategic. They build an enormous reservoir of goodwill. They champion the idea of sharing best practices rather than imposing binding directives.
They make themselves look like the most cooperative, pro-European member state in the room.
But once everyone is smiling and nodding, they aggressively pivot.
Here it comes.
They use all that generated goodwill to draw a massive immovable line in the sand.
They basically say, because we are all such great Europeans and because we all respect each other's unique cultures so much, the EU Commission must absolutely, fundamentally respect our national labor systems and refrain from top-down legislation.
Is defensive diplomacy executed through positive reinforcement? They use the very language of European integration, mutual respect, diversity of systems, cooperation to actively block European integration in the labor market.
They weaponize the EU's own vocabulary to protect their national sovereignty. That is brilliant.
It really is.
Okay, we have covered the historical origins of the market diplomats, and we have done a deep dive into the invisible, tactical machinery of how they manipulate Brussels. But now I want to pivot to something much more tangible.
Okay.
I want to look at the physical, concrete manifestation of this diplomacy, because Denmark is no longer just writing clever directives and manipulating committees.
No, they are literally physically rewiring the geographic map of Europe.
Exactly. You are referring to the energy islands. And it is difficult to overstate the scale of this. This is perhaps the most ambitious, transformative physical infrastructure project in modern European history.
If you want to see this bureaucratic maneuvering poured into concrete and steel, look at the Baltic Sea right now.
The cornerstone of this strategy is the Bornholm Energy Island, along with massive artificial island hubs planned for the North Sea.
Right. Just recently, Denmark and Germany signed a binding agreement to link 3 gigawatts of offshore wind energy generated at the Bornholm hub directly to both of their national grids.
And the EU Commission is heralding this as the first major delivery of their Continental Energy Highways initiative.
To truly grasp the geopolitical weight of this, we need to look at the paradigm shift it represents regarding sovereign resources.
What do you mean?
Well, for the last century, a country's energy paradigm was simple. You dug coal out of a mine within your own borders, or you pumped oil from a rig off your own coast, and you burned it strictly for your own national use.
Energy was a jealously guarded national asset.
Exactly. But what Denmark is doing with these offshore energy islands is fundamentally changing that logic. They are transitioning offshore wind from a national resource into a shared pan-European resource.
They are turning the turbulent waters of the Baltic Sea and the North Sea into massive, interconnected green power plants that feed multiple countries simultaneously.
And this infrastructure is not just about keeping the lights on in Berlin or Copenhagen. It ties directly into a critical emerging technology known as Power-to-X, or PTX.
Now, you might be thinking, why do we need a special technology with a sci-fi name like Power-to-X if we already have wind turbines? It comes down to the fundamental physics of renewable energy, doesn't it?
It does. Wind power is fluctuating. Sometimes a massive storm rolls through the North Sea, and the turbines generate so much electricity you don't know what to do with it.
And other times, the air is dead calm.
Right. And our current electrical grids are not designed to store massive amounts of raw electricity long term. You cannot capture a hurricane's worth of energy in standard lithium-ion batteries.
So what's the solution?
Power-to-X solves this fundamental storage problem by taking that massive surplus of wind electricity and converting it, the X in the equation, into sustainable, combustible green fuels.
We are specifically talking about using electrolysis to create green hydrogen, which can then be synthesized into green ammonia or e-methanol.
Which is the absolute holy grail for decarbonizing heavy industry.
Right, because while you can run a Tesla on a battery, you absolutely cannot run a massive Maersk cargo ship carrying 20,000 shipping containers or a Boeing commercial airliner on a battery.
No, the batteries required would be so heavy the ship would sink and the plane would never leave the runway. You need energy density. You need a combustible liquid fuel.
Exactly. By mastering the engineering and the infrastructure of Power-to-X, Denmark isn't just decarbonizing the European electricity grid. They are strategically positioning themselves to become the primary providers of the sustainable fuels that will power the entire global shipping and aviation industries for the next century.
And if we look at their diplomatic actions, they are completely ruthless about securing this future.
How so?
They are not just patiently building the new green system. They are actively, aggressively trying to dismantle the old fossil fuel system globally.
Right. In 2021, Denmark co-founded BUAGA, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance.
The explicit stated goal of this diplomatic coalition is to force countries to set a hard, legally binding end date for all oil and gas extraction worldwide.
And they established credibility by applying the pain to themselves first, didn't they?
They did. Denmark, which was historically a significant oil producer in Europe, passed legislation committing to ending all North Sea fossil fuel extraction by 2050.
Wow.
Furthermore, they took their agenda to the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, which governs global shipping. They led a fierce diplomatic charge to force the IMO to adopt a goal of zero-emission global shipping by 2050.
So they are regulating the old fuels out of existence, knowing full well that they hold the patent and the production capacity for the new fuels.
Exactly.
So they are literally building the physical extension cords that will tie European geopolitics together, and they are trying to monopolize the maritime fuel of the future. But this aggressive expansion raises a massive, glaring question about vulnerabilities.
It really does.
What happens if the wind just doesn't blow for 3 weeks? By making Germany and the rest of Europe heavily reliant on these offshore Danish hubs, are they inadvertently creating a new catastrophic strategic vulnerability?
It's the critical underlying anxiety of any renewable heavy grid.
I mean, we all just witnessed the economic devastation that occurred when Europe relied too heavily on a single node of energy, Russian natural
And
gas.
the Danish strategists are acutely aware of it. The analysis we are reviewing, particularly a deep dive report from the French Institute of International Relations, IFRE, highlights the reality of the Danish grid today.
And what's that reality?
Despite the massive wind capacity, Denmark still relies heavily on dispatchable power sources to balance the grid when the wind drops. Currently, natural gas still plays an important balancing role.
Which creates a severe tension point given their explicit, loud desire to phase out fossil fuels entirely.
Exactly.
So what is their bridge fuel? How do they keep the lights on when it's a calm day in the North Sea?
Biomass.
Biomass.
Yeah. Burning wood pellets, agricultural waste, and organic matter in retrofitted power plants. It provides the steady, predictable baseload power that makes their massive, fluctuating wind expansion mathematically possible.
But as the IFRA report notes, the sustainability credentials of biomass remain an incredibly contentious and heavily debated question.
Extremely debated.
Right, because is it truly sustainable to chop down trees in the Baltic states or the U.S. South, process them into wood pellets, ship them on diesel-burning cargo ships across the ocean, just to burn them in a Danish power plant so they can claim their grid is green?
It is a heated debate. But for right now, the brutal reality of physics means biomass is the only thing keeping the Danish grid stable enough to support the energy islands.
That is wild. Okay, so we have seen how they dominate the EU internally with process manipulation and how they are rewiring the energy infrastructure externally. But the final piece of this geopolitical puzzle kicks us out of Europe entirely.
It does.
We need to look at Denmark's role in the global south. And I want to pause here for a moment to address you, the listener, directly.
This is important context.
It is. The strategy documents we are about to discuss outline the Danish government's official approach to global development aid, which explicitly and unapologetically links international charity to irregular migration, asylum policy, and hard security interventions in fragile states like the Sahel in Africa and Afghanistan.
Right.
I want to be perfectly clear. Either I nor the expert are taking a political stance on this. We are not endorsing these policies, nor are we criticizing them from a left-wing humanitarian perspective or a right-wing nationalist perspective.
Absolutely not.
Our mission today is simply to impartially report on the factual content and the underlying logic of the Danish government's official strategy, a document titled The World We Share, so you can fully understand the mechanics of their geopolitical framework.
Thank you for setting that boundary. That context is absolutely vital, because if you approach the Danish development strategy expecting standard idealistic international charity, you will be deeply confused.
It's very different.
Their approach to aid in the global south is just as pragmatic, highly structured, and ruthlessly calculated as their approach to dominating wind turbine markets.
Let's start with the baseline numbers. Denmark is one of the very few nations on Earth that actually consistently meets the United Nations target of spending 0.7% of its gross national income on international development aid.
In absolute terms, they spend a massive amount of money.
Yeah.
But it is how and why they spend it that breaks the mold.
To understand the how, you really only need to look at the business card of one of their most important diplomats, Ole Thunk.
Yes, he holds a fascinating dual title. He's the Undersecretary for Development Policy A&D, the official climate ambassador for Denmark.
Those two portfolios are usually housed in completely different buildings in most governments.
Oh, totally. But it is a deliberate, structural fusion. In the Danish strategic view, climate policy and development policy are indistinguishable. You absolutely cannot solve one without the other.
Consequently, Denmark has committed to directing a full 30% of all its development funds specifically to climate-related efforts.
And if you dig into the spreadsheets, you see that the majority of this money isn't going towards building shiny new wind farms in developing nations to reduce global carbon emissions.
Wait, really? Where is it going?
It is going towards adaptation in the poorest, most vulnerable regions on Earth.
Mitigation is about stopping climate change. Adaptation is about helping societies survive the climate change that is already baked into the system.
Yes. Danish funds are building flood defenses in coastal cities, developing drought-resistant agriculture in arid regions, and securing clean water supplies.
But the strategy document, The World We Share, doesn't just present this as a moral imperative to help the poor, does it?
No, it takes it a critical step further. It draws a direct, explicit causal line between climate change, extreme poverty, violent conflict, and human displacement.
This is where we see the ultimate integration of foreign development policy and domestic border security.
Exactly. The Danish strategic assessment views climate change as a threat multiplier. The logic chain is stark. Severe droughts in the Sahel lead to failed agricultural harvests.
Failed harvests lead to widespread, desperate poverty.
Poverty leads to violent conflict between communities fighting over rapidly shrinking resources,
And violent conflict leads to the mass displacement of millions of people who have lost everything, who eventually start moving north.
which results in waves of irregular migration toward the borders of Europe.
So what's their solution?
The Danish calculus is that by investing heavily, early, and aggressively in climate adaptation, water security, and job creation in fragile regions like the Sahel or Afghanistan, they are attempting to stabilize these regions at the source.
So the explicit written goal of the world we share is to mitigate the core pressures that fuel irregular migration and forced displacement, long before desperate people ever feel the need to pay smugglers and undertake incredibly dangerous journeys toward the European continent.
Exactly. It is a fascinating proactive approach to border security.
But the strategy documents also reveal that this aid is not a blank check.
Definitely not.
They enforce strict, hard-nosed conditionality on this funding. The strategy clearly and unapologetically states that Denmark will generally refuse to provide long-term development assistance to sovereign states that refuse to cooperate on readmitting their own citizens if those citizens are legally deported from Denmark.
It creates a closed-loop system. It ties the receipt of vital humanitarian and structural development funding directly to a nation's cooperation on Danish domestic asylum and border management priorities.
If you don't help us manage our borders, we won't help you build your water infrastructure.
Essentially, yes. Furthermore, they don't just wire cash to NGOs and hope for the best. They deploy a mechanism they call strategic sector cooperation.
Which loops us right back to the ethos of the markets diplomator from the 1960s, right?
It does. Strategic sector cooperation means Denmark physically sends technical experts, engineers, and bureaucrats directly from the Danish government ministries, experts in groundwater management, agricultural yield optimization, or grid stability.
And they send them to sit inside the ministries of partner countries in the global south.
Exactly. It is direct, government-to-government knowledge sharing.
They are exporting bureaucratic competence.
They really are.
So when you step back and look at the whole picture, the 0.7% spending target, the strict conditionality on taking back deported citizens, and the deployment of technical experts to stabilize failing regions, it sounds like Denmark has completely redefined the concept of international charity.
It's no longer just about altruism or feeling good.
No, it is a strict, highly calculated tool of national security, border management, and demographic stabilization. It feels highly pragmatic, almost entirely transactional.
I think transactional accurately captures the strict conditionality, but holistic might be the word the strategist sitting in Copenhagen would prefer to use.
Fair point.
In the deeply pragmatic Danish view, building resilient, democratic societies that are based on human rights and the rule of law in the global south is not just a nice charitable thing to do for the world.
It is the single most effective, mathematically sound way to secure Denmark's own future borders, protect their welfare state, and maintain domestic stability.
Exactly. It is a total fusion of genuine, deeply held humanitarian values with hard-nosed, unsentimental geopolitical realism.
Their defining philosophy is that you can only truly take care of Denmark by forcefully managing the chaos of the outside world.
Precisely.
And that brings us perfectly full circle. We started this hour by questioning how a state with the population of a single American city can possibly punch so far above its weight class on the global stage.
And the answer, as we've uncovered, is that they don't rely on the traditional math of aircraft carriers and landmass.
No, they exert power through relentless, highly coordinated, unapologetic pragmatism. Let's summarize the incredible journey we've been on today.
It's been quite a ride.
We started back in the 1960s with the markets diplomator, the clever civil servants who played Britain against Germany to ensure the survival of their butter and bacon exports.
Right.
We saw how that exact same bureaucratic DNA evolved into a modern economic juggernaut where aggressive climate policy guarantees a captive European market for their massive 13 billion euro wind turbine industry.
We decoded the masterful manipulations of EU bureaucracy, elevating technical gridlock to the ambassadorial level through process impartiality, and forging unlikely, highly transactional coalitions with coal-reliant countries like Poland to punch directives through the Council.
We looked at how they are literally rewiring the physical map of the continent with the Bornholm Energy Island and Power-to-X technology, maneuvering to own the maritime fuels of the future while actively legislating fossil fuels out of existence.
And finally, we explored how they deploy that exact same pragmatic mindset to their global development aid, utilizing climate adaptation funding and strict conditionality as a direct, forward-deployed tool for global stability and European migration management.
It truly is a masterclass in modern small-state influence.
It is. But as we look to the future, it leaves us with a significant structural question to ponder.
What's that?
We've seen exactly how Denmark uses its incredible bureaucratic agility to run circles around larger, slower states within the consensus-driven machinery of the European Union.
Oh.
But as the global climate crisis accelerates, and as green technology evolves at breakneck speed, will the traditional, slow-moving institutions of the EU and the UN be able to keep up with the required pace of change?
That is the million-dollar question.
Or will agile activity leaders like Denmark eventually outgrow and bypass the very diplomatic frameworks they helped build, seeking faster, more direct coalitions of the willing to force global change?
That is a brilliant thought to leave on. When the traditional machinery of global diplomacy is gridlocked, it's the agile navigators who get to write the rules of the new reality.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us for this extensive deep dive on diplomacy and international relations.
Thanks for listening.
If you found this exploration into the mechanics of power valuable, please make sure to follow the podcast on your favorite app. And we strongly request that you take a quick moment to rate us 5 stars. It truly is the absolute best way to help the show reach even more people who are fascinated by the hidden gears of global politics. Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface.